All of these beautiful liturgies of Holy Week enable us to enter into the story. And tonight is no exception. We have an opportunity to reflect upon 12 of those characters from the gospel story with some artistic representations of what might have gone through their minds. So as we reflect tonight on what they might have thought and said, we imagine what we would have felt, what we would have said, what we might have done. Let us pray. Jesus, you spoke with passion, you acted without fear, and we remember. Purify our hearts and grant us zeal in your service. In your name we pray. Amen.
All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The first station, the woman with the alabaster jar. Oh, yes, I remember him. He said that wherever the gospel story was told, your deeds will be remembered. He was like no other man I'd ever known, and I'd known plenty. It was his eyes. His eyes could see to the center of my soul. I wanted him to know everything about me. I wanted him to give me forgiveness. I wanted to be set free from that life that had come crashing down around me. For him, I would have given anything, all I had. I don't know why I thought of it, but I took the oil from the merchants, pure nard. It was the most expensive thing I had ever owned. I won't tell you how I got it. But I just wanted to give it to him. No, I had to give it to him. So I broke the bottle and I poured it over his head. The disciples were furious. They couldn't believe what I'd done. They were so angry about the waste, and they couldn't believe that Jesus had let me near him. But he just looked at me deeply. He understood. With another glance, his disciples fell silent. And then he said a funny thing. He said I had anointed him for burial. I didn't know what he meant. I was just standing there in a room full of silenced, angry men. I was standing there right in front of Jesus. I wanted to cry and laugh all at the same time. Who was he? I'll tell you this. In my hand, I held a broken bottle. But inside, my broken soul was healed.
She brought her very best, precious by far. She left all her fears in an alabaster jar. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The second station, the one with the water jug. I knew them all, of course. Peter, James, John, all the rest of them. I'd seen them about. I make it my business to know. Information is very useful to some of my clients. Information is power. He wanted a room, Needed somewhere quiet in Jerusalem, somewhere he wouldn't be disturbed. Somewhere quiet in the middle of Jerusalem at Passover? That's going to take some doing. I found them their room. It was very nice. Up above the crowds, away from prying eyes. He needed that, Needed time with his friends. I didn't know then, but he needed that time to say goodbye. I showed his disciples where it was. They had a code, too. They asked the landlord. The teacher says, "Where is the room where my disciples and I will eat the Passover meal?" That way, he'd know they were genuine. I only met him that time, and that's my regret. I wish I'd had more time. We always wish for things when it's too late. The next time I saw him, I was crushed in a crowd of screaming voices and raised fists, and there he was. But this time, he was being dragged by Roman soldiers. This time, he was covered in open wounds. This time, he was carrying a wooden crossbeam. Like I say, I'm the go-between. I help people smooth their way, make things happen. But now, there was nothing I could do. I was powerless and didn't feel good. If only he'd spoken to me earlier. Perhaps I could have done something. Maybe found him a safe passage, called in some of the favors that are owed to me. A few words here, the odd bribe there. I could have got him out. The crowd moved on, but I just stood there, staring. He was gone, and I was left standing beneath a darkening sky, a fixer who couldn't fix.
She found Jesus a space, a very quiet room, so he could be with friends before he was laid in a tomb. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The third station, the high priest's servant. I remember him, and I remember that night. We moved in at night. See the darkness. It gives you the edge. The element of surprise allows you to strike fear into the heart of your enemy. We came armed with clubs and swords and a few handmade specialties. We weren't taking chances. His disciples were big blokes, fishermen, Galileans, hard men. They could put up a decent fight if they needed to. The insider showed us the way and identified him. The one I kiss, that was our signal. That way we heard which one to grab in all the chaos and confusion. I tell you, he may have served our purpose, but I wouldn't want a friend like that. Everyone hates a traitor, even if he's working for you. But you see, the thing is, I was close. I saw what happened. That moment when the traitor kissed Jesus, just before we grabbed him, he said, "Friend, do what you have to do." And there was a look in his eye. Something passed between him and the traitor. Something I can't explain. A look of understanding, acceptance. I don't know. Seconds later, I was writhing on the ground, and that big gorilla sliced my bloody ear off. Jesus stopped the violence, though, told them to put their swords down. "Enough is enough," he said. Then he turned and looked at us and asked us why we hadn't come before. Why come now in the darkness when he'd been out in the daylight preaching in the temple? Good reason for that, of course. We didn't want a riot. We didn't want the crowds getting involved. Not at Passover. Not with all those people. Place is like a tinderbox as it is. So we dragged him away, and his friends scattered. I began to worry about what we were going to do that, mixed with the pain of my severed ear. Why had that bloke actually done? Why were we doing this? I remember that look between the traitor and his master, and the weirdest idea came into my head. He couldn't have planned all this, could he? He couldn't have known what was going to happen. It was as though he willingly gone with us, as if he had been in charge the whole time. I don't know, but I had the strangest feeling then, and I still have it now.
The servant followed his high priest for the deed, then lost an ear, but now does he believe. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you
The fourth station, the landlord. It was late at night when I first met them. They looked cold and scared. He was trying to put a brave face on it. You could tell he was a good man, an honest man, but he looked way out of his depth. And she seemed so young, so vulnerable. They both did. Country folk, up from Nazareth, easily taken in by the ways of the city. Of course, they were two of thousands of travelers passing through for the Roman census. There were so many like them, but they seemed so different somehow. If they knew something that they couldn't communicate, something that had terrified the life out of them. I ran an inn in Bethlehem in those days. Hundreds of people passed through my doors. I dealt with my share of drunks, losers, and Roman troops who had no intention of paying. But I knew with this couple that they were genuine. They came into my place road-weary and sore. They seemed so down on their luck. As they walked in, I realized she was about to give birth. He looked at me imploringly, but I had nowhere. Everything was booked up. All of Bethlehem was booked up. But then I had a stable out back. It was tiny with my old donkey standing in it. Anyway, they were so grateful, so relieved. And then there he was, born in my stable, with Zeb, my old donkey, standing outside. The news went around fast, of course. Always does when there's a new baby to be seen. People always love babies. Even the shepherds looking after the local herd got in the act and came to see what was going on. I had to chase them all away in the end. Poor girl, she needed sleep, and he looked exhausted. I must say I felt proud that night, like I was the father myself. Didn't feel that again until I had my own kids. Just so happy I could do something for them. Well, they went away soon after, and I didn't see them anymore. Didn't expect to. As I say, there were thousands like them on the move. It was odd, though. I kind of heard rumors over the years. An important holy man from humble beginnings teaching in Galilee. Some people told me he'd been born in a stable in Bethlehem. But you always get a lot of stories in my game once the wine starts flowing. But strangely, I did meet him again. Only by that time, he was a man. I sold up the business in Bethlehem by then and moved back to manage the wife's family place in Jerusalem after her father died. I hadn't seen him since he was a tiny baby, but my cousin had been following him. He's the bright spark of the family. He knew all the details, and I put two and two together. Who was he? I didn't ask. His disciples had organized everything. I had a reservation and I had to keep my mouth shut about it. No problem around here. You learn to keep your mouth shut if you don't want the patrols becoming interested in you. I had a good room, and they were pleased. An important meal by all accounts. So you see, I gave him shelter right at the beginning of his life and at the end.
The landlord had the room for the Passover meal. He remembered his stall where many came to kneel. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
fifth station, Simon of Cyrene. I was on my way to Jerusalem for the Passover. I'd heard about Jesus. I knew he'd be there. I was hoping to hear what he had to say. I came from a city of philosophers. There were always new ideas buzzing around in the cafes, bazaars. People would discuss the deepest topics. How did the universe originate? Is there true knowledge? Is there reality beyond this world? As I came into the city, I could see a crucifixion party coming up the hill. Just some other poor unfortunate dragging his own means of torture behind him. It's a horrible, inhumane way to die. As I got nearer, I could hear the crowd jeering, real hatred in their voices. Hatred that comes from having been let down. Hatred, scorn, fear that you might be next. The victim looked as though he couldn't go on. Seemed to me he'd lost a lot of blood too. I wondered how he'd managed to get this far. Before I knew it, the Roman soldiers grabbed me. The Roman soldiers knew their trade. Didn't want a dead man on their hands. Didn't want to give him that luxury before they had a chance to nail him up. So they made me carry his cross. It was heavy, full of splinters and slippery with his blood. I was scared, really scared. How had I got into this? I was frightened the drunken troops might crucify me by accident. The victim was dragged in chains right beside me, head down, breathing hard, trying to overcome the pain. I didn't know he was a revolutionary, an activist, a slave who tried to escape. Who knows? As I say, there were a lot of crucifixions, but I could hear him mumbling, and I realized he was praying. He was praying all the time. Know who you carrying that cross for? The Roman sergeant punched me on the arm as he spoke. No, I said, I've never seen him before. That's Jesus, that is. King of the Jews. He doesn't look much like a king now, does he? I don't know if it was the heat of the day or a trick of the light, but as I stared at him, as I lugged that bloody cross up the hill, I swear he turned to look at me and said, Simon. He said my name. Right there in the midst of all that violence and hatred and jeering and blood, he said, Simon, no more. But he said it in a way that no one had ever said it before, or since, like he really knew who I was. But how could he? I didn't know him. I'd never met him before in my life. And when he said my name, the fear subsided. I knew I could do this one last thing for him, right at the end of his life. And his eyes, they were so kind, so full of sorrow, like he cared for the people who were doing this to him, like he was praying for them.
They made him carry the cross for a man he never knew. His life forever changed by the King of the Jews. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The sixth station, Veronica. What could I, a poor woman, do? Well, in this case, more than a man. They never have let a man go through the crowds. Never would they let a man wipe his face. That crowd, that hateful, despising crowd. A few days before, they were cheering him on. All that dancing and carrying on. how quickly it can turn, how fickle they are. Hard faces, eyes that lusted for blood, that enjoyed seeing a weaker person suffer. And the arrogant soldiers, flexing their muscles, showing off to the girls, while they're beating the crowds with sticks. He stumbled, and I saw my chance. In a moment, I was through the line of those hateful people, the column of red-cloaked soldiers, past the swords and the clubs and the metal that cuts flesh and the wood that crushes bone, past the words that sear and burn. I took off my headscarf. And I held his head in my arms, wiping the blood from his face as much as I could. I held him close to my breast, like a mother with her child, cradling him in the midst of all that horror. It was just a moment, and it felt like eternity. For as long as I could, I held him. And then they pushed me aside. I fell into the road. Under the feet of the crowd, they left me. And then they were gone, on up that hill to his inevitable end. I sat by the side of the road, just holding my headscarf in my hands. And I wept. Who was he? He's the one whose imprint and image I bear.
The woman fought her way into the hateful, jeering mob. Will her scarf come clean? Will all her crying stop? All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The seventh station, Judas Iscariot. So quick to condemn me, so quick to blame, they made me their scapegoat. All along I worked for him, served him. I'd been his treasurer, his confidant. I had his ear. I'm good at solving problems, sorting things out, getting things done. He needed me. I thought he needed me on that final day. I thought he knew what he was doing. I thought he had it all planned. Everything was planned. The donkey, the Passover, my price, 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver and a soul damned for eternity. They took him, they condemned him to death, and I led him straight to him. I led them straight to him. I thought he knew what he was doing. I thought the kingdom he was always talking about would come. I didn't think he'd actually have to go through it. And there he was, covered in blood, carrying that cross up that hill. And I was the one that sent him there. I watched as he fell in sheer exhaustion, the weight of the wood upon him, head down, staring at the earth beneath, dust and death, shadows and darkness, and I couldn't do nothing about it. He was a man, a very human man, a man I believed in, followed, loved, and betrayed. A condemned man carrying his cross in blood and sweat and fear, unable to bear the weight of that beam, falling down to the ground. I have seen death. This was a very real death. Could you bear his pain? Could you bear mine? Who was he? The man who saved me or condemned me? I don't know. He died on that hillside, and I was to blame.
He once was Jesus' friend. Now all he feels is shame. A cross wasn't the plan. He knew he was to blame. All human in this place, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The 8th station, the woman caught in adultery. I didn't mean things to go that far, to get that out of hand. It just sort of happened. I mean, sometimes a woman has needs too, you know. Rough hands grabbed me. There were loads of them dressed in black with blank, pious faces, and it was me they accused, never mind the man. Where was he in all of this? I'll tell you where he was. He'd done a bunk. Yeah, right out a second-floor window at the first sign of trouble. He was quite happy to let me face the music on my own. It takes two to tango, you know. Well, they dragged me along the hard ground, barely let me get a chance to cover myself, right through the marketplace and flung me down at the feet of that teacher, Jesus. Why did they take me to him? Well, I realized later that what they were doing. You see, according to the law, I had committed a capital offense. For what I had done, they could stone me, and you could see that that was what they wanted to do. Pious, religious men, never a bad thought in their heads, never an instance of desire or lust. They wanted Jesus to say, "Stone her." He was preaching a religion of love, a God of love. He was saying, turn the other cheek. But if he told them to stone me, he'd be discredited. He'd be a hypocrite. That would be the end of his mission. But if he told them to let me go, then they could say he was a dangerous heretic who didn't obey the law of Moses. Again, he'd be discredited and liable to be stoned himself. They thought they'd had him trapped, but he was far too clever. He knew what they were really up to, what they were thinking. So what did he do? He wrote in the sand. That's right, just wrote in the sand. And then he looked at them with those piercing eyes of his. The men just sort of melted. All they wanted to do then was to get far away and hide. He looked at them and said, "The man standing here who's never sinned is welcome to throw the first stone." They judged themselves, and they knew there'd be no stoning that day. They were so full of sin that all they could do was walk away very quickly. Well, when they'd all gone, he looked at me, but now his eyes were full of kindness. He helped me to my feet, helped me rearrange my tunic, and said, "But where are all these important religious leaders who were so anxious to stone you? Where have they gone? Is there no one here to condemn you?" "No, Lord," I replied, "there's no one." "Well then," he said, "I don't condemn you either. Go and don't do it again." What did I do? The only thing I could do. I followed him. I was there with him on that awful day, standing by the cross with the other women, the day the sky turned black. In the end, it was only us women who did stand by him. Men, in my experience, just seemed to run away. You ask me who he was, I'll tell you. He was the man who saved not only my life, but my soul as well. He didn't want anything from me. He wasn't trying to trick me with smooth words or false promises. He wasn't like the others. Everything he said was reliable. Everything was true. He was the best man I ever met. His love and acceptance gave me a new start, a new pathway. My life changed forever that day.
He would not be her judge, so no one threw a stone. Her life forever changed by the true love he had shown. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The ninth station, John Mark. I saw the fight and how in the end he stopped it all. I saw that traitor kiss him and the guards take him away. And I saw all the disciples bolt for it, frightened for their lives. But I stood, watching too long. Suddenly, I realized there were soldiers all around me, and one of them grabbed my shoulder, but I was lucky. I was small and fast. I managed to get both arms out of my tunic and run. The soldier was left holding the cloth, and I got away. As I ran, I could hear them laughing. I looked back and saw them holding up the tunic, waving it at me, mocking and pointing. I just kept running till I thought my lungs would burst. I was so scared. That was the worst night of my life, hiding out in alleys and doorways, cold and terrified, listening for the patrols. They'd taken him. Everyone had fled, and I was all alone. I was there the next day. I hid at the back of the crowd. I saw him carrying the cross up the hill. He was covered in blood. I've never seen anyone in so much pain. I couldn't bear it, the indignity of it, the shame. They'd beaten him up so badly, humiliated him with that spiked crown and stupid robe. I wanted to run in there and rescue him, fight the soldiers myself, but the women stopped me. None of his disciples were there by then, only some of the women who'd followed him. One of them tried to help him. She got through, but she was nearly trampled by the crowd. Somehow I managed to pull her out. He fell 3 times. 3 times under the weight of that appalling cross. And every time his cuts got deeper, the splinters dug further and further into his skin, and his muscles tore. Every time it got harder and harder to get up, and when he fell, the soldiers just whipped him all the more. I couldn't get near Golgotha. It was too dangerous. I was frightened they'd recognize me, so I just hid near the walls. But I heard what happened later. I heard from the women how he died. They told me that an important man had buried him, and where the tomb was. Later, I went and sat there. I just wanted to be near him. Just wanted to say I'd been there on that awful night, and on the day of total abandonment, the day when all hope died.
He hid all night, terrified, afraid he would get caught. He saw the man crucified, unaware the knives he bore. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see.
The 10th station, the high priest's servant girl. I remember him. I remember the night that he was taken, and I remember that big bloke he was always with. You couldn't miss him, always looking self-important. He shoved me out of the way when I tried to get near. I kicked him in the shin. He said, "Git." Peter, his name was. I saw them drag Jesus in, all the priests and the guards and a mass of others. There were loads of shouting, people hitting each other, spitting and swearing. They took him up to the high priest's house for the trial. Poor guy. Didn't think he'd stand much chance when once they got hold of their teeth in him. I knew what they were like. When I turned round, I could see people sitting by the fire, and I was sure I recognized one of them. So I went over to see, and sure enough, there he was, the same bloke that had shoved me off the road a few days earlier. "Ha! I know you," I said. "You're one of his mates. What are you doing here?" He stood up sharp at that. The guards were looking at him by then, weighing him up. He looked scared, not so tough now. He said, "What are you on about? I've never met him." "Oh, yeah?" I said. "Well, how come I saw you with him near the temple 2 days ago? You shoved me out of the way. I know who you are." He walked off then. He was trying to get away. Then someone else said, "Yeah, I've seen you too. And anyway, you know him. You're a Galilean." They all started laughing then. Everybody knows all Galileans know each other. But he looked angry and scared by then. "I'm telling you the truth. So help me God," he said. "I've never seen that man. I don't know what you're talking about." But it was weird. After they'd all accused him and laughed at him, just after he'd said that he didn't know Jesus, he started to cry. A great big bloke like that, crying like a baby in front of everyone. He took off then, into the night. A few people tried to stop him, but he was too strong. He pushed them aside and ran off. I've never seen a man cry like that before.
She knew he was one of them, but 3 times he denied. She attacked his pride and was amazed at how he cried. All you in this place, hear and see. All you pass this way, hear and see.
The 11th station, Barabbas. Do you really know who I am? Want to know my name? Want to hear if I remember your Jesus? Well, I tell you, I'm the one who should have got what he got. Yes, that's right. I'm Barabbas. What's it to you? Want to hear that I was a good man? That I made up for what they did to him? That I've spent my life in good works trying to repent for all that happened? Well, I haven't, and I wasn't a good man. I was a thief, and I murdered Roman soldiers. At least I was prepared to do something, not like your Jesus of Nazareth with his path of peace and passive resistance. Peace. Ha! What's peace? There will never be peace. I expect you want me to say that I should have been it should have been me up there, huh? That I should have been crucified and not him. That I had done wrong and deserved what was coming to me, while he had done nothing. Is that it? Is that what you want? Well, you can stuff it. I don't care about him or anyone else for that matter. They let me go, and he died in my place. Well, who among you wouldn't say yes to that? Ask yourselves, really ask yourselves, all the horrible ways that humans legally kill each other. Would you go to your death that way? Or would you take the pardon and let someone else go for you? You didn't have to think too hard, did you? And crucifixion, could you face that? Would you willingly be nailed up high in the burning sun for hours, days, gasping, fighting for breath as your lungs begin to swamp with fluid? And you do fight. Ironic, isn't it? The will to live is so strong you'll even fight when it's obviously hopeless, covered in your own filth, screaming in your own blood. Most of them are driven mad by thirst and pain. Would you do it? Or would you let someone else do it? I don't see many hands going up. I don't see many volunteers. If anyone would follow me, let him take up his cross. Pick up a cross? Really? Do you know how heavy a crossbeam is? Could you carry a crossbeam strapped to your lacerated back through the streets of hating crowds? Could you endure the spitting, the kicks, the punches, and the whip when you didn't move fast enough? Could you be nailed screaming onto this piece of wood and then be hauled upright to face torturer and accuser? A cross. Could you pick that up? I couldn't, and I didn't. It was him. Who was he? I don't know, but he had guts. He took it. He took it from me, all the way to Golgotha.
Barabbas was his name, a mean and guilty man. They let him out of jail, no idea he was part of the plan. Oh, you pass this way, hear and see. Oh, you pass this way, hear and see.
The 12th station, the Roman Centurion. I'm from North Africa originally. My father and my grandfather were officers. I was expected to be in the Army. And I've been an officer for 15 years. I'm part of our auxiliary detachment. We answer directly to Herod. And our job is to police Palestine. Now, Passover is the hardest time of the year. The Jews are passionate about their religion. Now, the Army's been family to me, and no one disrespects your family. If they do, they'll know about it. And these people are trouble. That's why you have to come down hard on any of them that step out of line. There are zealots trying to kill you and religious maniacs trying to create sedition. You can't have these people loose in this kind of place. It's too dangerous. You make an example of some to warn the others. Don't get any funny ideas. It's the only way to keep law and order. Now, crucifixion is not simply a way of killing people. You can do that with a sword quite easily and quickly. Crucifixion is reserved for the politicos. A cross looks like a signpost. And it is. See that signpost? Take a good hard look and think about it. We're in charge. You step out of line, and this is what you'll get. Have no doubt about it, buddy boy. We don't mess around. And are you really sure you want to lead the masses in revolution? You're much more likely to end up here than sitting on a throne in some royal palace drinking fine wine. It's a clear message. You can stand up and be counted for your cause, but Rome will have the last word. We know what we're doing. We are the power. That day, there were 3 of them headed for Golgotha. I didn't come on duty until the morning. The poor wretch we were leading, it looked as if they'd spent the entire night beating him up. He'd already been pretty badly whipped, already lost a lot of blood. I didn't think he'd last long once we got him there, if we could get him there at all. In the end, we had to grab someone from the crowd and get him to carry the crossbeam. There was no way this bloke was ever gonna make it. The King of the Jews, they call this one, sir. They made him a crown of thorns, and they say he's a miracle worker and a prophet. I looked at him then, and through all that blood and sweat and grime, I realized with a jolt that I knew him. Two years earlier, I'd been stationed in Capernaum. My servant had been ill, and the doctors could do nothing for him. I'd heard about Jesus, this Jewish prophet, and I asked for him. Well, he'd been willing to come to my house. He was willing to defile himself in the home of a Gentile. Just to heal my servant? But I knew that he didn't need to. He could have healed from wherever he was. Just give the order, I said. He was like me, a soldier under command. I looked again at this poor, beaten man. I couldn't believe it was him. What could I do? I had no superior to ask, because I was the superior. I couldn't act against Roman law, or my men, or the crowd that was baying for blood all around me. It's like I say, you're not in control. Suddenly you realize that they are. You have to act because they demand it, and they are practicing in their own oppression, and you have no choice. We took him to Golgotha, and the soldiers automatically went into action, nailing him to the cross, hauling up the crossbeam, dividing any possessions amongst themselves. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't catch his eye. The horror of what I was doing, of what I was directly responsible for, was burning in my brain. I was powerless to do anything? I powerless to stop it? How had it come to this? But in an unguarded moment, I did catch his eye. I expected him to hate me for what I was doing, for what I had done, how much he'd done for me and my servant, and now I was doing this to him. When I caught his eye, I knew he recognized me. And I still can't believe what happened. It's the only thing in the face of this broken, wretched man, as he looked at me, was forgiveness. Forgiveness. He was forgiving me for all of this, for everything. I haven't never seen anything like it. Truly, this man was the Son of God.
A proud man of the law, who had witnessed Jesus heal, knew he was forgiven, and he knew that Jesus was real. All you in this place, hear and see. All you pass this way, hear and see.
The 13th station, Martha. I was a friend of Jesus, but I didn't start off as such. He changed my life. I was an angry person, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I always thought I knew best, People did what I wanted, or I'd throw a tantrum. I like to think I was doing them a favor, like to be bossy, always organizing everything, always in charge. Was a bully to my sister. I made her life hell. Most people cowered away from me. I had that power. They respected me, but also hated me. He got the measure of me the first time I met him. He knew immediately what I was like. I tried, of course, tried to use the guilt tactics that were usually so effective. Don't you care that I'm doing all this work? Don't you care that Mary is just sitting there, staring at you with her big eyes? While I fuss around, making everybody feel uncomfortable, while I make the whole room feel awkward. But it made a difference to him. Mary had chosen the better part, was all he said. That floored me. Most people didn't answer me back. They wouldn't have dared. I hated how much he was the center of attention. That's where I like to be. But his words melted my soul, and the touch of his hand on my arm was peace. Deep peace. Not like a tranquilizer, that's just numbness. This was healing. But it also meant I realized what I was, what I'd been doing. And Zacharias met Jesus. He gave most of his money away. He righted wrongs that he'd done, paid double to people he'd swindled. That was hard. But in many ways, my road was much harder. I somehow had to repair the psychological damage I'd done to people. I had to convince people that I was different. It wasn't easy. People take a long time to change their opinion of you. But I did change. And when I changed, I found I loved speaking to him. He always had a different way of looking at things. He was a good friend to me and to my brother and sister. He stayed with us in Bethany whenever he was near Jerusalem. One time, we were talking late into the night, and he said to me, "I am the resurrection and the life." He asked me if I believed him, and I did. I truly did. I remembered that on that terrible day, the day they took him, the day they took his things, they took his lifeless body down from that brutal cross. I had given everything up for him. I had changed beyond my imagining. I had given him my soul. But through my tears, all I could see was the poor, battered body lying in that awful place. We could only stand and watch, me and the other women, grateful that at least Joseph would give him a decent burial. The resurrection and the life, he had told me. But all I could see was his bruised, bloody corpse. I stood and watched as the sky blackened and the rain began to fall. Only a couple of soldiers left now, and Joseph's servants lifting the body onto a stretcher. Soon there would be no one left. The world was moving on. People had other things to do. I could only stand and watch. I had changed, but now I had lost everything. Where was this resurrection? Where was this life?
Martha's heart was hardened till softened by Jesus' care. She had learned a new way. His
The 14th station, Joseph of Arimathea. He died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on that Friday. And of course, Friday, the day before the Sabbath. And that Sabbath just wasn't any Sabbath. It was the most important holy Sabbath of the entire year, the feast of the Passover. So I had to act quickly. You see, in Jewish law, the next day starts at 6 p.m. the night before. He died at 3. 6 o'clock, you can't have any work after there. So this had to happen quickly. The Romans, you know, they don't bury the bodies of criminals or terrorists. Usually they're just thrown down from the high beams and left on the ground for the vultures and the wild dogs. Golgotha, the place of the skull, outside the city, away from decent people, the place of torment and despair. The ground littered with the bones of so-called Roman justice. We're not like them. We have a law from a higher source. We bury our dead. I knew they couldn't afford a tomb. Galilean peasants? Do you know how much a tomb in Jerusalem costs? But I knew I'd be taking a risk. By going to Pilate, I would be showing my hand, implying that I was in sympathy with this teacher. I had to play it carefully. Insist that the demands of the law meant his body couldn't hang on the cross on the Sabbath. It also meant I'd be making myself ritually unclean on 2 counts. By going to the house of a Gentile and by touching a dead body. Did it matter? Yes. It meant that on the most holy day, I wasn't able to eat the Passover. I had a high status. I was an important man. I had a place on the council, and people looked up to me. But when I saw him there, hanging on that cross, humiliated and beaten, I realized everything I had was meaningless. The fine clothes, the expensive wines, the best seat in the synagogue, the private tomb, none of it meant anything. It was a moment of clarity. I had no choice. I asked the Roman governor for the body of Jesus. Who was he? He was the one who called me, just as he calls you. To leave cowardice behind, to make a decision, to be in solidarity with the kingdom of God, to go through his death to resurrection, to commit yourself to the road, his road, the road less traveled, the road of transformation, the road of reconciliation, the road of justice and peace, the road to Golgotha.
Important was this man who gazed at Jesus on the cross. He could afford the price of a tomb, but he couldn't pay what this life costs. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see. All you who pass this way, hear and see. Pass this way, hear and see. Do you know it now? Are you singing? All you who pass this way,
As we continue to pass his way, may your ears be open to hear him. May your eyes be open to see him. May your heart be open to receive him. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.